Welcome to the Next in Queue podcast, a not-so-safe space for all kinds of news, views, and dialogue. Brought to you by Quilliam International.
You're listening to Next in Queue, and I'm your host, David Toube. Today, we're in conversation with Sara Khan, the lead commissioner for the Commission for Countering Extremism, a body which has been busily going about its work for 1 year. Sara, welcome.
Hello.
So you were born in Bradford. What was your family background and childhood like?
Well, my father came to this country from Pakistan in 1963, and I have an older sister, an older brother, and a younger brother, so there were four of us. I remember quite a happy childhood, actually, because I used to live on a street with English girls and Indian girls and Pakistani girls, and we used to all just play as we did as children. And I remember, we used to do the performance for cats. Put on a show. Well,
you put on a performance for cats or the musical Cats?
So we used to prepare. We were saying to our parents, we're going to put on a performance of Andrew Lloyd Webber Cats for you, and we'd play the entire song, the entire series of the Cats song.
Did you sing them yourself, or did you?
No. It was a dance performance.
You're kidding me.
So it was a dance performance, and this is how we used to spend our time. And we'd put on a performance for all our parents, and I just remember skateboarding a lot and roller skating a lot, and I was the odd Asian girl who used to go ice skating on a Sunday when I was about 8 years old, and there were very few Asian girls who used to go ice skating. So I just remember a very, very happy childhood, but also in contrast to that, experiencing racism at school and being called the P word and seeing that kind of vitriolic racism on the one hand, but then at the other, I was also very alive to the fact that there were young Muslim girls, Pakistani girls, who were also being forced into marriages and experiencing honour-based violence. And so I was very aware, I think, of social injustice quite early on in my childhood.
That's interesting. I mean, I remember my childhood, which was in Essex, but very similar. And I remember having a very broad range of friends. I think my best friends and my sister's best friends were a Sri Lankan family, and I remember going into their house and two things. I remember them having incredible sort of Sri Lankan carvings, and I remember the smell of asafoetida. Asafoetida, which is absolutely central to Sri Lankan cooking. It seems like a very happy time.
It was, and it was very multicultural. There was, we all used to all live together.
Right, it was multicultural wonderful. In the true sense.
Completely.
There was a shared culture.
Absolutely.
Being children and living in the area, but also, you go into someone's house and they'd have made samosas and they were amazing.
Exactly, and my next door neighbour Jenny, she had a wonderful dog, and we used to all play with the dog, and it was just a great time. But again, at the same time, being very aware of issues around racism, patriarchy, misogyny, and not just from externally in society, but also internally within Muslim and Pakistani communities as well.
The external stuff, in terms of racism, are there any sort of incidents that stand out for you? Do you remember anything?
Yeah, it's funny because I don't actually have the best memory in the world, and I kind of blame that on my children. I'm sure it's since I've had my kids, I don't have the best memory. But it's funny how you, as a child, you do genuinely remember what happened to you at school and when
absolutely.
You get bullied.
And particularly the racist incidents, they are absolutely the ones that stay in your mind.
They do. And, there were lots of occasions that I remember from primary school up to secondary school. And, it would be on the playground often. But I used to always think, that whatever you say to me, yes, I'm upset by it, but I'm never going to allow you to make me feel I'm not British. And I think that's partly because my father, when he did come to this country, he is genuinely one of the most patriotic men I know. He imbibed in us and this kind of feeling of, this is your country, you contribute to Britain, you are British. And I thought, no matter what these racist kids say to me, I'm never ever going to let you make me feel that I am any less British than you. I am British, I know who I am, and I'm not going to let you, form a different identity or have an impact on me in that way, from an identity perspective.
Now, I've got a very similar memory of the time, and I remember when I was, I think, 9, there was a boy in my class who was one of my best friends called Ian, and he called a girl in the class whose name was Geeta a Paki, and I hit him. And it was a really weird thing because I think it was the only time I'd ever hit anybody as a child. But what you say about parents, our parents' generation. My father also came to this country in 1962, a year before your dad, and he came because he came from South Africa, which was a society which had institutional, pillarized racism, hardwired into its constitution. And Britain for him was basically a Shangri-La, a sort of an ideal place where people had equality, which was simply not the case in his childhood. I mean, your father's perspective might have been very similar, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think it was. I mean, he came from Mirpur in Azad Kashmir, which is, it's a very small town. And
a lot of people from Bradford do come from Mirpur.
They do. And funnily enough, my dad didn't have any sisters. He had 7 brothers. Right. And so, you'd kind of think he's probably quite conservative. And, in some regards he was. I mean, he had an arranged marriage with my mother. But he was always, interestingly, and he kind of reminded me a little bit like Malala's father, very pro girls' education. So he really, really wanted to ensure that his daughters, well, obviously his sons as well, but he had a special thing about daughters' education and making sure that they were financially able to earn a living, to stand on their own 2 feet. And that really mattered to him. And I used to always find that quite interesting, how this was somebody who came from a part of Pakistan where that was not the norm, and it certainly wasn't the norm in his family. And so he for me, I thought that was just an incredible thing. And I always think, if he hadn't ever made that journey to this country, I know I would not be living the life that I have now. I would not be having the opportunities that I have now, the freedom that I have now. And so I'm really eternally grateful to him for making that journey.
But despite all of that, you donned a hijab, you joined Young Muslims, you became active in organisations which some might say had a sort of structural prejudice against women in positions of power.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I grew up in a family, and my father, I would say, is largely secular. He never supported groups like Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan. He thought they were fundamentally an organisation that were never going to allow or see Pakistan to progress into the country it was always designed to become.
Right. I mean, Jinnah certainly didn't see the future
exactly.
of Pakistan in Islamist
That's
terms.
right.
Despite it being a Muslim majority state, that was not his vision.
It wasn't at all. And so, it was interesting because I think I was born just after the Iranian Revolution in the 80s. And so for me, I remember as a young teenager, there was something in the air around Islamist revivalism and activism, and I did get drawn into Young Muslims. I remember reading Sayyid Qutb's Milestones as a teenager. I remember reading a lot of Maududi and Hassan al-Banna's books as a young teenager. Wow, how did you get your hands
on those?
Well, it was predominantly through Young Muslims at that time, because in those days, I mean, now it's a post-Islamist organisation, but in those days, it very much, subscribed to those worldviews. And so I had read all of those things as a teenager and attended circles and events.
And what sort of debates were you having internally on it? Because, I mean, you can look at these texts and think, well, okay, there's some things you can take out of them, but fundamentally I disagree. I mean, was there an open debate about them, or was this essentially a programme of acculturation into the politics of Jamaat-e-Islami?
Yeah, I never thought it was a debate. It was more just, this is what they believe, this is why it's good, this is why it's important. And I actually remember one time when I was sitting in Markfield in Leicester. Everyone, for those people who are not familiar to Markfield, the Islamic Foundation in Leicester, as a 14-year-old. And I just remember sitting there and just thinking, this guy, he'd been speaking, I can't remember who it was, but he'd been speaking for an hour about Hassan al-Banna. And I just remember thinking to myself, I don't hear enough about our own prophet, but you're constantly lecturing to me about Maududi and Hassan al-Banna. And that always sat with me very, very uncomfortably. And so, I did go and attend those events. But at the same time, I think, again, my father, I think, played a very important role, because I remember him once coming back, for example, from the mosque after Friday prayers with a leaflet, and it was a HT leaflet. And he kind of said to me, Sara, now let me tell you, this group, never associate yourself with this group. And he sat down and explained to me why HT was bad. And again, that kind of resilience building was quite important for me, because I recognised, that what HT were about quite early on. I don't think my father understood what Young Muslims was about and what they were promoting and preaching. But having read that literature, I think was really important for me to do that, because it helps me understand my work now as the lead commissioner and understanding Islamist ideology.
I mean, my plan was to take you sort of gradually through your life, but this is a great moment to sort of leap forward to the position of the girls growing up in East London, in particular, the number of schoolgirls who went off to join Islamic State. I mean, it's very difficult sort of hearing their stories not to think that there must be some link to the sort of message they were being provided by a number of hate preachers at a number of prominent institutions who said, Islam is under attack, the caliphate is the only solution, you have a religious obligation to support a caliphate, and the caliphate will purify society by applying the hudud punishments. I mean, do you see a parallel with your situation back then and the sort of situation these girls found themselves in when they decided to go off?
I mean, the parallel that I see is that I am very alive and aware to the fact that those girls, like myself and so many of the girls I know, were exposed to Islamist ideology and teachings. And in fact, I think as a society, we underestimate just how much of that is going on, how much of it is out there in communities. And, you know, I remember speaking recently to an ex-HT female activist, and she was saying to me, and one of the questions I asked her, it was actually for my book, when I was writing my book, and I was doing research, and I just said to her, because she was really heavily involved in HT as a young teenager, and I said to her, at that time, if ISIS had come on the scene, do you think you would have made that journey? And she just looked at me, and I don't think she'd really thought about it. And she said to me, just very quietly, yeah, you know, I probably would have, because I was in the thrall of that Islamist belief, ideology, we need to live in a global caliphate. And if then ISIS had come along and as they had done, which was, you know, give very clear instructions of how to make that journey, which was what happened to those girls, yes, I probably would have made that journey. And again, I think this is an issue that has been going on for decades. I know that because when I was growing up in the 80s and the 90s, I know that was the case, that Islamist ideology was being promoted, not on social media in those days, but in our communities in this country. And I know that's the case now in our country. But now you've got the added problem of social media, which has been mainstreaming these ideas on a much on a much bigger scale than ever we saw happening in the 80s and the 90s.
No, agreed. I mean, it's a very important issue for the Commission to look at. And it is remarkable, really, that the people who are being drawn into this are not idiots. They are not people with social problems, by and large. They are very often the cleverest people, the people with the most active minds, who find these ideas fascinating but have sort of no counter-arguments against them. And, you know, it's a bit like a school debating society where only one side of the motion is ever debated.
But that's the point. I think the counter-arguments is really critical. Where were the counter-arguments when I was growing up? I mean, I think the thing that saved me was kind of the resilience building from my own father, but actually my own critical thinking. I had to literally depend on my own critical thinking to question what I was hearing. And again, but there was a lack of counter-arguments, and I sometimes wonder if still that is fundamentally the problem now.
One of the things about being an extremist is that you are driven to do things. I mean, extremists, for all their flaws, are at least motivated. They establish organisations, they network, they are prepared to give their spare time up to propagate what they believe in. Moderates, by contrast, are lazy people. They have better things to do with their lives, and they do not put the effort in. And very often that means that what they have to say is not as effectively transmitted to the audience that most needs to hear it. But you did something very strange for a moderate. You established Inspire. Tell me, what is Inspire and why did you decide to create it?
So I helped co-found Inspire in 2008, and it was a women's counter-extremism NGO. And, you know, at that time, apart from Quilliam, there wasn't really any other counter-extremism organisation, and there wasn't a female counter-extremism organisation. And I decided to set it up because I had spent a long time working in organisations like the MCB, the ISB, YM, and one of the two things that really frustrated me was that there was a complete denial in those organisations about growing Islamist ideology and the radicalisation of young Muslims in our country, and also the fact that there was widespread gender inequality within Muslim communities. I call those two things the two elephants in the room in Muslim communities, and that's how I felt at that time. And yet nobody wanted to address those issues. And so out of pure frustration...
It is a shame, that, isn't it? Because, the MCB should be, and it is certainly by its constitution, an umbrella organisation. And so there should be room within the MCB for diversity. There should be room for, Islamists debating anti-Islamists, people who believe in a traditionalist approach to the role of women, to those who have a liberal approach to women and their participation. But yet, that isn't what you found within these organisations at all.
There was just clearly a kind of denial of, no, we don't want to address this issue. It's too difficult. It's the difficult conversation. And for me, having spent a lot of time working in organisations where I was exposed to Muslim women all the time who were telling me their horror stories, I just thought that it was unacceptable that we couldn't help women. And again, because I'd done a master's in human rights, that's who I am. I am someone who has for a long time been driven by the principles of equality, human rights, tackling social injustice. If I saw all of these things, I literally couldn't live with myself and think, I can't do anything about it. I've got to do something. So when I came to the realisation, well, a lot of these mainstream organisations are not going to do it. Well, fine, I'll just roll up my own sleeves and do something about it myself. And so me and a colleague decided to set up Inspire. And, we didn't have any money, we didn't have any offices, we didn't have any funding, we didn't have any resources. The only thing we did have was a kind of burning sense of injustice, the desire and the zeal to do something. And we thought, well, let's just see where it takes us. And so I quit my job, which was that back then a hospital pharmacist, the safety of a regular income.
It's a huge step to take.
It is.
Because there is absolute certainty in a monthly paycheck.
No, it was, and I was frightened.
There isn't doing what you've been doing.
And I was frightened because I remember it quite vividly. I remember feeling like I'm literally about to stand into a dark tunnel, and I don't know what's going to happen. Plus, I've got my father who keeps thinking I've got to, be financially independent. Got to worry about him as well. So it was quite a scary time. And again, there was no precedent of organisations like this. And I remember quite early on, I knew that we were going to struggle because funding bodies did not want to touch us with a barge pole.
What you'd hope is that you'd be able to go to an organisation like the MCB and say, OK, we understand you don't want to do this yourself, but here's an arm's length way of at least sort of dipping a toe in the water. Did you approach Muslim organisations and ask for funding and assistance?
I approached a lot of Muslim charities, and probably, a great deal of them in this country, they didn't want to fund. Again, they saw these as two very controversial issues in Muslim communities. I kept pointing out that these issues are going to get worse, particularly the issue of extremism. It is going to get worse. We need to start doing this. And it's going to get worse for our country, but also for Muslim families and young people. They're the ones that are going to be impacted by this most. Radicalisation is going to impact our children first and foremost. But they were, nobody wanted to address that. But I also obviously approached funding bodies. And in those early days, this was just complete new territory. And I had this conversation with a lot of funders recently as well as in the past. And risk-taking is something a lot of funders don't want to do. And this was risky work.
And the nature of the risk is what? That it might not succeed, or that they may be mired in controversy?
Well, a bit of both. Firstly, there was just no real understanding of Islamist extremist ideology. There was a concern that if they funded a body like us, they may be accused of being Islamophobic. That was something I'd heard a few times. And also they just didn't understand the area. And so that was the challenge. I think that slightly changed amongst funding bodies when ISIS came on the scene, and they could see firsthand young people and people like Shamima Begum leaving the country. They could start to see it more. But they couldn't understand the complexity of Islamist groups in our country back then. And so it was just so difficult to operate because we just had so little funding.
No, it's a great irony, isn't it? That I've thought this about a number of issues. People are only going to get it when it has become such a big problem that it's almost too late to tackle it. And everybody understands, the problem with radicalisation now, but if there'd been an understanding of this 10 years ago or 15 years ago, then the infrastructure to tackle it could have been put in place.
And also, I've had some very fruitful conversations with funders where I've said to them, you need to be in a situation where you're looking ahead now in 20 years' time on what is the threat that's facing us from wherever it's going to be. and to start putting in place now work to mitigate against that threat. Because that's what I've learned from the extremism challenge, that I could see the threats coming. Other people, like Quilliam and others, could see the threat that was on the horizon. But people weren't prepared to understand that threat and to do something about it. Because perhaps if we had done stuff early on, maybe we wouldn't be in the mess that we're seeing now with the cases like Shamima Big and other cases like that as well.
I mean, it's very important for people to get ahead of curves, and the failure to get ahead of this curve is a significant contributor to the difficulty we find ourselves in now. I mean, it's fair to say that, Inspire did meet a significant amount of opposition, vitriol even. Where was that coming from, and what sort of things were you having people say about you?
How long have we got, David?
Let us devote 5 minutes to talking about that, because I know it was absolutely terrible. I mean, it was personal attacks as well.
I mean, it just incredible, the amount of hate, vitriol, smears, character assassinations, fake news, that just was thrown at both Inspire and at me again and again and again. And, and it came from everywhere. There was obviously the hatred from the far right, that I was used to. There was hatred from the hard left. I mean,
what sort of hard left?
The hard left for me was really interesting, because I'd never been exposed to the abuse and intolerance from the hard left. I was quite familiar. We're all familiar with what hatred and intolerance looks like from the far right. But as a Muslim woman who holds, who stands up for gender equality and human rights, the kind of abuse and intolerance from the hard left was really shocking to me. I mean, I remember, just as one example, attending a left-wing feminist conference where the organizer, who's a lovely woman, I have so much respect for her, she asked me to come along, and as a kind of sign of solidarity, to talk about some of the work that we were doing, including calling out Muslim preachers who condone marital rape, who encourage honour-based violence and domestic violence, who say that the role of women is within the home, and all of that stuff. And I remember talking about it, and there were left-wing feminists sitting in the audience, standing up and shouting Islamophobe at me, literally shouting Islamophobe at me. And, I had to defend and push back against that. And I remember the poor lady who was organising the conference was, apologising to me profusely. But that was something I've experienced again and again and again, that as a Muslim woman who believes in human rights, who believes in equality, the number of times I have been labelled an Islamophobe in the name of Islamophobia I can't even tell you the number of times that's happened to me. And particularly when I've been challenging and calling out Islamist groups in our country. I mean, the Islamist groups are in effect the Muslim far right or the Muslim alt-right in our country. So when Muslims are calling that out and then they get labelled an Islamophobe for it, you just have to scratch your head and think, this is so deeply perverse. Where does this end? And where's the solidarity?
And deeply upsetting as well, because, these are essentially the people you might have expected to be your greatest
It's
supporters.
For me more upsetting to get that from the left than I did from the right, because I know what to expect from them. But when I first used to get it from the left, it was deeply, very upsetting to experience that. And I still get it. There's a very toxic debate at the moment, a narrative where if as a Muslim you're countering Islamist extremism, and this is not just my experience, I've been going around the country and speaking to imams and other Muslim activists, when they challenge Islamist extremism, they get labelled an Islamophobe by left-wing academics, by other people on the left, who claim to care about anti-Muslim hatred, but they do it in the name of anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I sometimes think that the difference between far-right hatred and far-left hate-mongering is that far-right people, I think, kind of know that they're the bad guys. Whereas there is an absolute conviction on the left that they are the voices of the angels. So introspection is something that you very rarely find. I mean, part of the other sort of thing that I think had led to this was that a lot of the far left aligned itself with Islamist groups because they saw them as effectively the vanguard against imperialism. But all that changed with Syria, because in Syria, when the far left aligned itself with, by and large, Syria and Putin, suddenly the groups that they were arraigned against were Muslim groups, particularly Sunni Muslim groups, and particularly the ones that were Islamists. So there's been a sea change in that.
There has, but there's still, I think, at a kind of very local level in this country, still an alliance between the Islamists and the hard left, because obviously the third group that I used to get a lot of abuse from was from the Islamist groups themselves. And I mean, that was just deeply vitriolic. I mean, the number of times, the number of fake news stories I've read about myself, and I know it came from the Islamists. They manufactured this whole kind of image about me, but it was also obviously deeply misogynistic. I mean, I remember the amount of abuse that I personally got after running our anti-ISIS campaign, making a stand. I mean,
Which is extraordinary when you think that would be the least controversial thing.
I would have never thought that running an anti-ISIS campaign would result in the scale and abuse that I received from both Islamists, but also from the hard left. I mean, I remember, people on the hard left calling me a state-sponsored Islamophobe because the Home Office had actually funded that particular campaign, as they were funding a lot of, anti-ISIS campaigns at that time. But, it was deeply incredible, but for me also real eye-opener. And I'm so glad as painful as it was, I'm so glad I went through that experience, because it made me realise how deeply rooted the challenge of extremism is in our country.
The shocking thing is, the people who are throwing this sort of accusation against you and other people like you are not sort of random cranks, socialist worker sellers at tube stations, but they include prominent academics at serious universities.
That's right. No, that's right.
But nevertheless, you continued undaunted.
Well, the funny thing is, I think abuse is one of those things where it either destroys you or it makes you stronger. And for me, the more they kept throwing at me, the more I thought, I'm going to do it even more. It's just my nature. If anyone tells me not to do something or tries to stop me from doing something, that irates me on a different level. I just think I'm going to keep going.
Were you
and
a
doing it even
difficult
more.
and disobedient child?
I wasn't, but I was very, very, as my brother will testify, very independent, very, I remember when I did my interview for Desert Island Discs, and I was telling them, I was this 13-year-old hijab wearing, headbanging rock chick because I used to love heavy metal, and that's the kind of, I suppose growing up, there was I was reading Islamist books, but I was also really heavily into Guns N' Roses and Nirvana.
I mean, that's a really interesting point, and I'm going to segue into it, even though I had something else I wanted to talk about now, because I remember a friend of mine telling me about a childhood friend who got involved in an Islamist group, and the friend turned to him and said, "This is the punk rock for our generation." It is, when you put the hijab on, when you got involved in those organisations, wasn't there a bit of you that was trying to, shock your parents who were not from that sort of political or religious background at all?
I mean, I think there was an element of teenage rebellion, and I suppose that for me was an outlet, as was the heavy metal. It was a way of kind of...
There's always been this division, isn't there, in northern towns between the people who are into sort of... Iron Maiden and the people who are into the Smiths.
Yes.
And you were more of an Iron Maiden
I think
sort
so.
of person.
That was me.
So what sort of things were you doing at Inspire? You put on workshops, but you also engaged in sort of legal action against governmental bodies.
Yeah, I mean, back in 2008, 2009, the threat at that point was coming from Al-Qaeda. So a lot of the programs we were doing were in partnership with local authorities, delivering not only gender equality empowerment training programs, but also delivering work on theological counter-narratives to extremist ideology. So that was really critical. And the vast majority of Muslim women would always just say, we've never been taught this or exposed to this. So there was a lot of things we were doing around there, delivering conferences, but also, yes, absolutely the kind of legal work we were doing. And I think the three cases that I'm the most proud of, I really am proud about them, is firstly when Universities UK back in 2013 produced guidelines saying that if a speaker comes on and demands gender segregation, you should accommodate that. And I remember being enraged by this because I'd attended Muslim events where gender segregation was enforced, and I thought, here I have now a British university, state funded, telling us in violation of the Equality Act to accommodate the demands of an Islamist preacher who has no regard for women's rights. And there were Islamist preachers at that time still now, who were condoning marital rape and domestic violence, and somehow saying we also now need to accommodate gender segregation for them. That outraged me.
And this in a university.
This was what the Universities UK guidelines were. So it came from the top. And so, I remember just thinking this is outrageous and just campaigning about this and doing a lot of media interviews. But the abuse, came almost immediately. But again, in the end, the Equality and Human Rights Commission ruled that Universities UK were wrong about that. And so I felt we were vindicated despite all the abuse, the backlash, the threats to my children, people, Muslims accusing my children of being apostate. In the end, we were vindicated because we were we were right. We were on the side of the law. That was one example. The other example was the Law Society, and I think that was in 2014, when they issued guidelines saying if Muslims want Sharia-compliant wills, then that's okay. And these are the guidelines. And they basically said that women and daughters could be discriminated against. They would have half the amount that their sons would have or brothers would have, and that type of guidelines. And again, this absolutely enraged me.
Right, because there's a distinction, I think, between a person saying, well, we'd like to buy this product, meat, a financial services product, which complies with the requirements of religion, but something which has a direct impact upon families in the family sphere is a much more controversial issue.
I saw this as an example of just discrimination in the provision of services and, like you're saying, in the family. But again, it enraged me. I thought, I'm sitting in London in 2014. This doesn't even happen in Morocco anymore. But in London, you're telling me that as a Muslim woman, it's okay for me to be discriminated against in the kind of prism of inheritance, and it just outraged me. And so we started issuing legal proceedings because I knew that on every level, the Law Society were not meeting their own equality and diversity framework. Never mind what the law was saying, and in the end, they had to push back against that. But what I found really interesting was that at that time, again, we received a lot of abuse from Muslims in particular. But what I found interesting was that Muslim organisations, those in particular who campaign against Islamophobia and anti-Muslim discrimination, couldn't see that this was an example of anti-Muslim discrimination. It was discrimination against Muslim women. But because it was following a very conservative interpretation of religion, many of those groups who claim to be challenging Islamophobia actually subscribe to a conservative interpretation. So if it means discrimination against women in the name of Sharia, then that's okay. And for me, that was deeply problematic because actually there are many egalitarian interpretations of Sharia which don't subscribe to that particular view.
But the assumption, I think, among many white and liberal people is that Muslims are strange and exotic and do things in odd ways, and we must simply leave them to their eccentricities. And that was kind of the approach that the Law Society was taking.
And it was like, but first and foremost, I'm a British citizen. Why am I right different to Jane sitting next to me, who's also a British citizen, but you're treating me differently to her? And that was the thing that really upset me and outraged me. And also how sad I felt that very few organisations, equality organisations, wanted to campaign and support this issue. I felt really let down by that. So again, we issued legal proceedings and, alongside a couple of other small handful of organisations, and the Law Society had to back down. So that was another example. The most recent one before I left Inspire that we carried out was when we challenged Al-Hijra School. Ofsted had, there's a long story about the Al-Hijra case and I won't go into it, but that school was practicing gender segregation. It was a state-funded school, and we put in evidence to the Court of Appeal because it had reached the Court of Appeal. And again, our argument was that the way Al-Hijra is behaving is in violation of the Equality Act, and schools in this country have the legal duty to uphold the Equality Act. This is going to harm both girls and boys, but girls in particular. This was a school that held books in its library condoning domestic violence and all sorts of horrific things. And in the end, 3 Court of Appeal judges agreed that this was a violation of the Equality Act. But again, the amount of vitriol, abuse, I had left-wing academics call me an Islamophobe, and that, what I had done was anti-Muslim. And again, you kind of think, well, what message does that stand? So if you're saying as a Muslim, I'm standing with the law, which is the Equality Act, and that makes me an Islamophobe, what on earth does that mean for wider Muslims? What kind of messages that's sending out there about what Muslims stand for and don't stand for? So despite the fact that what my position was in alignment with the Equality Act and with our law, I was somehow the baddie as opposed to Al-Hijra School carrying out gender segregation and gender inequality.
Well, that's a perfect place to wrap up the first part of this interview. We'll talk in the second part, in part 2 of this podcast, about your work as Lead Commissioner for Counter-Extremism. Sara Khan, thank you very much for joining us.
You've been listening to the Next in Q podcast, brought to you by Quilliam International, the civil society movement challenging extremism. Please support our work by becoming a member of Quilliam Circle at quilliaminternational.com/circle. Tune in next time to see what's next in Q.